Imagine for a moment a man standing alone in the darkness of a small room in a forgotten Persian town, and in the silence of that room he suddenly cries out words that no human being had ever dared to speak before. He cries out, "Glory be to me! How great is my majesty!" Now stop and think about that for 1 second. A man, a mortal, a servant, standing in prayer, declaring his own glory as if he himself were divine. If you heard someone say this today, you would call him insane, arrogant, perhaps even dangerous. His own students thought he had lost his mind. Some historians say the people of his town wanted to have him executed for blasphemy. And yet, this very man is remembered today, more than 1100 years later, as one of the greatest saints in the history of Islamic mysticism. He is remembered as Sultan-ul-Arifin, the king of the Gnostics, the king of those who know. His name was Abu Yazid Taifur ibn Isa ibn Surushan al-Bistami, known to the world simply as Bayazid Bastami. And tonight, I want to take you into his world. I want to take you into the heart of a man who did not simply worship God from a distance, the way most of us do, but a man who walked so close to the flame of divine love that his own identity burned away in it. This is not just a story about religion. This is a story about ego. It is a story about identity, about the war between the self and the truth, about what happens when a human being stops asking, "What do I want?" and instead surrenders completely to something larger than himself. Whether you are a person of faith or a person of doubt, whether you come from Islam or from any other tradition, or from no tradition at all, I promise you that the story of Bayazid Bastami will make you question who you really are. Let us go back. Let us go back almost 1,200 years to a small town in the northeastern part of Persia called Bastam, in the region known as Khorasan, in what is today modern Iran. This was a land where the old fire of Zoroastrian Persia had only recently been touched by the new light of Islam. Bayazid's own grandfather, a man named Surushan, had been born a Zoroastrian and had converted to Islam. So Bayazid was born into a family that stood at the crossroads of two great civilizations, the ancient Persian world and the new Islamic world. And in many ways his entire life would become a bridge between the mysticism of the East and the theology of Islam. His father, Taifur, was known as one of the leading and respected citizens of Bastam, and he came from a family of ascetics, men who chose to renounce the comforts of the world in favor of spiritual discipline. But here is something remarkable, something that the old biographers of Bayazid love to tell, something passed down through generations of Sufi storytellers. They say that his extraordinary spiritual sensitivity began even before he was born, while he was still in his mother's womb. His own mother is reported to have said that whenever she ate food that was of doubtful or questionable origin, food that may not have been earned or obtained in a completely lawful and pure way, the child inside her would stir and become restless, and would not settle down until she removed that food from her mouth. Think about that image for a moment. A child still unborn, still formless, already sensitive to purity and impurity, already rejecting anything tainted, anything unclean, anything that was not completely rightful. Whether you take this story literally or as a legend built by loving followers to explain the greatness that would come later, the meaning behind it is powerful. It tells us that from his very conception, Bayazid Bastami was marked as a man of extreme spiritual sensitivity, a man for whom purity was not a rule to be followed but something felt in the very blood and bone. As a young man, Bayazid did not run off into the desert as a wandering hermit, as some might expect from a mystic. He remained rooted, at least outwardly, in the discipline of Islamic law. He belonged to the Hanafi school of Islamic jurisprudence, and he studied that law with great seriousness. He did not neglect the outer obligations of his faith, the prayers, the fasting, the acts of worship prescribed by the tradition. This is an important point, and I want you to hold on to it, because later in his life, Bayazid would say things so wild, so shocking, so seemingly beyond the boundaries of ordinary religion, that people would accuse him of abandoning the law altogether. But the truth is that Bayazid never abandoned the outer path. He built his mystical flight upon the foundation of the law, not in defiance of it. He believed, as many great mystics believed, that you cannot fly to the heavens on broken wings. You must first master the discipline of the earth before you can even attempt to touch the sky. And yet, even as a young man deeply committed to religious study and practice, something inside Bayazid remained restless. There was a hunger in him, a hunger that no book of law could satisfy, a thirst that no ritual alone could quench. He wanted more than knowledge about God. He wanted God himself. He wanted not information but union. And this is where the story of Bayazid Bastami becomes truly extraordinary, because it is the story of a man who was not content to simply believe, but who was determined to know, to experience, to taste. In the language of the Sufis, there is a famous distinction between ilm al-yaqin, the knowledge of certainty, which is what you learn from books and teachers, and Ayn al-Yaqin, the eye of certainty, which is what you see with your own inner vision, and Haq al-Yaqin, the truth of certainty, which is what you become one with so completely that there is no longer any distance between you and the truth itself. Bayazid was not satisfied with knowing about the ocean from a book. He wanted to dive into it. He wanted to drown in it. He wanted to become indistinguishable from the water itself. It is said that Bayazid sought out many teachers in his relentless search for the deeper reality of faith, but it was one particular teacher who transformed his entire path, a mysterious figure named Abu Ali al-Sindi. This man is a fascinating figure in the history of Sufism, because some scholars and traditions describe him as a convert to Islam, who came originally from the region of Sindh, in what is today Pakistan, a land where Buddhist and Hindu spiritual traditions had flourished for centuries before Islam arrived there. What makes this relationship so beautiful and so unusual is that it was not a simple one-directional teaching. According to the old accounts, Abu Ali al-Sindi, though he had embraced Islam, had not yet mastered the fine details of Islamic religious law and practice, while Bayazid, who was already deeply trained in Islamic jurisprudence, had not yet unlocked the inner secrets, the deep mystical realities, the interior dimension of faith that goes beyond mere legal correctness. So the two men are said to have exchanged knowledge with one another. Bayazid taught Abu Ali al-Sindi the outer forms and obligations of Islamic law and practice, while Abu Ali al-Sindi opened Bayazid's eyes to the deeper realities of divine truth, to the reality of losing oneself completely in God, the reality that would later be known in Sufism as Fana, annihilation. Before we go further into that teacher-student relationship, I want you to understand something about the physical discipline Bayazid put himself through in those early years, because the ecstatic states he would later become famous for did not simply fall out of the sky onto a man who had done nothing to prepare for them. The old biographers describe years of prolonged fasting, of staying awake through entire nights in prayer while his body screamed for rest, of deliberately choosing seclusion over comfort, of denying himself food, sleep, companionship, and every ordinary pleasure that most human beings consider essential to a bearable life. He is said to have practiced such extreme self-denial that at times his own body became almost unrecognizable to those who had known him before, worn thin by the sheer intensity of his devotion. This was not self-punishment for its own sake, and it was not an attempt to earn God's love through suffering, as if pain itself were the currency of salvation. It was rather a deliberate strategy, a kind of spiritual surgery aimed at weakening the grip of the ego, starving the appetites that keep the small self so busy, so entertained, so endlessly occupied with its own satisfaction that it never has the stillness required to see beyond itself. Bayazid understood something that modern psychology is only now beginning to rediscover in its own language, that the constant chase after comfort, pleasure, and distraction is one of the primary mechanisms by which the ego keeps itself alive and in control. By stripping all of that away, deliberately and repeatedly, Bayazid was not torturing himself. He was clearing the ground. He was creating the empty space within which something greater than his own hunger and fatigue could finally be heard. I want you to sit with that idea for a moment, because it is at the very heart of everything Bayazid Bastami would come to represent. Fana, annihilation. Not annihilation in the sense of destruction or death in a physical or negative sense, but annihilation of the ego, the dissolving of the small self, the passing away of the illusion that you are a separate, isolated, independent being standing apart from the divine source of all existence. In the mystical teaching that Bayazid absorbed and would spend his entire life pursuing, the human ego, the nafs, the sense of I and me and mine, is the greatest veil between a person and God. It is not sin in the ordinary sense that separates us from the divine. According to this teaching, it is self. It is the constant, exhausting, endless project of maintaining, defending, feeding, and glorifying our own individual identity. And Bayazid came to believe, with every fiber of his being, that the entire purpose of the spiritual path was to strip away that identity, layer by layer, like peeling an onion down to nothing, until what remained was not a self-experiencing God, but simply God, undivided, unopposed, without a second. This is why Bayazid Bastami became known, along with a small number of other early mystics, as a founder of what later Sufi scholars called the drunken school of mysticism, Suka in Arabic, as opposed to the sober school, Sahav, represented by figures like the great mystic Junaid of Baghdad, who was actually a younger contemporary of Bayazid. The sober school taught that the mystic, even after reaching the highest states of divine intimacy, should return to a state of composure, of balanced awareness, able to function in ordinary society while carrying the inner secret quietly, without shocking outward displays. But the drunken school, the school that Bayazid represents so powerfully, taught that in the overwhelming presence of divine reality, in the true encounter with the infinite, ordinary human composure simply collapses. Just as a person who drinks too much wine can no longer control their speech or their behavior, a person who is truly overwhelmed by the wine of divine love, the mystic said, cannot always control the words that come pouring out of them in that state of ecstatic intoxication. And this brings us to the single most famous, most controversial, and most misunderstood episode in the entire life of Bayazid Bastami. An episode that has been discussed and debated by scholars, theologians, poets, and mystics for over 1,000 years. It is said that one day, while Bayazid was deep in prayer, deep in a state of overwhelming spiritual absorption, words began to pour from his mouth that shocked everyone who heard them. He is reported to have cried out, Subhani, Ma'azama Shashani, which translates to, Glory be to me, how great is my majesty. Now understand what this means in the context of Islamic theology. The phrase Subhanallah, glory be to God, is one of the most common phrases of praise and worship in the entire Islamic tradition, spoken by Muslims countless times every single day. It is a phrase used to glorify God alone. For a human being to replace the word Allah with himself, to say Subhani, glory be to me, is, on the surface, one of the most shocking and seemingly blasphemous statements imaginable. It sounds like the ultimate act of arrogance, the ultimate claim to divinity. His own students who heard him say this were horrified. Some accounts say his followers even went so far as to physically restrain him or strike him, believing he had either lost his sanity or had fallen into terrible heresy, and some later reports even suggest that certain religious authorities considered these utterances grounds for execution. But here is where I need you to slow down and think deeply with me, because the meaning of this event is not what it first appears to be. Bayazid was not claiming, in some literal egotistical sense, that he, the son of Taifur, the man from the town of Bastam, was God. That interpretation completely misses the point of everything he lived for. What later Sufi commentators, and Bayazid's own students, came to understand was that in that state of overwhelming spiritual absorption, in that moment of complete Fana, complete self-annihilation, there was, in a very real experiential sense, no longer any Bayazid left present to be speaking at all. His individual ego, his sense of separate selfhood, had in that instant completely dissolved, completely burned away in the presence of the divine reality that had overwhelmed him. And so, the words that came out were not the words of a man praising himself. They were, in the understanding of the mystics, the words of the divine speaking through an empty vessel, a vessel so completely emptied of self that it could no longer distinguish its own voice from the voice of the one reality flowing through it. It would be like a hollow flute, completely emptied of anything of its own, through which a great musician plays the most extraordinary music, and for one brief moment, we might almost say foolishly, that the flute is singing about its own greatness, when in truth, the flute has become nothing but an empty channel for a music that is not its own at all. It is worth pausing here to place Bayazid within the wider company of mystics who dared to speak this way, because he was not entirely alone in the danger of this path, even though he was among the very first. About a century after Bayazid, another towering and tragic figure of Islamic mysticism, Mansur al-Hallaj, would utter his own famous ecstatic phrase, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, using one of the divine names of God to describe his own inner state in a moment of complete absorption, where Bayazid's community reacted with confusion and alarm, but ultimately preserved and revered his memory. Hallaj's utterance, spoken in a very different political and religious climate in Baghdad, would eventually cost him his life at the hands of the authorities, who saw in his words an intolerable public claim to divinity. The comparison between these two men is instructive, because it shows us that the line between ecstatic mystical speech and outright heresy in the eyes of the world is desperately thin, dependent as much on politics, timing, and interpretation as on the actual spiritual state of the person speaking. Later scholars within the Sufi tradition itself worked hard to draw a careful distinction, insisting that what men like Bayazid and Hallaj expressed in these moments should never be read as literal claims of personal godhood, but rather as descriptions of a state in which the individual self had become so thoroughly annihilated, so completely emptied out, that the voice speaking was no longer experienced by the speaker as belonging to himself at all. This is why the Sufis eventually developed a technical vocabulary to describe the full arc of the mystical journey, moving beyond Fana, annihilation, into a second and equally essential stage called Baka, subsistence or abiding. Fana alone, they taught, was not the final destination. A mystic who remained forever lost in that overwhelming dissolution of self, unable to return and function within the ordinary world, had not yet completed the journey. The truly perfected saint, according to this teaching, passes through Fana and then returns through Baka, to ordinary life, to speech, to relationship, to community, but now emptied of the old egotism, now carrying the divine presence within the very fabric of ordinary existence, able to pour tea, walk through a marketplace, teach a student, or bury a stranger's dog with the same undivided presence that once overwhelmed him on the heights of mystical vision. Bayazid's life, taken as a whole, with its combination of shattering ecstatic utterance and quiet, humble teaching, its wild nights of prayer and its gentle encounters with ordinary travelers, can be understood as exactly this full arc, the complete circle from self, through the death of self, and back again into a life, fully and humbly lived, but forever transformed. There is a companion story to this that many of the old sources record, and it is just as astonishing. It is said that once, someone came knocking at the door of Bayazid's house, and when Bayazid asked who was there, the visitor replied, "I am looking for Bayazid." And Bayazid said to have responded, "I too have been looking for Bayazid for 30 years, and I have not found him." Think about the depth of that statement. Here is a man who has spent decades of his life in relentless spiritual search, in fasting, in prayer, in solitude, in discipline, searching not for God out there somewhere beyond the clouds, but searching for the very thing that his contemporaries assumed was the most obvious and certain thing in the entire universe, himself. And after 30 years of the deepest possible spiritual searching, he comes to the staggering conclusion that there is no fixed, permanent, independent Bayazid to be found at all. The self that we spend our entire lives defending, decorating, protecting, and worrying about turns out, in the deepest mystical vision, to be something more like a passing wave on the surface of an infinite ocean, a temporary shape, a temporary name given to something that is, in its ultimate reality, never separate from the ocean itself. Friends, I want you to pause here and ask yourself an honest question. How much of your life, how much of my life, is spent defending, feeding, and worrying about this very same self that Bayazid Bastami spent 30 years searching for and could not find? We wake up every morning and immediately we are thinking about my reputation, my success, my possessions, my comfort, my pride, what people think of me, what I deserve, what I have lost, what I am owed. The entire architecture of the ordinary human mind is built around this fortress called I. And Bayazid Bastami, through decades of fasting, of solitude, of relentless prayer, of complete surrender, discovered that this fortress, when you look closely enough, when you search deeply enough, simply is not there in the way we imagine it to be. This is not a philosophy he read in a book and repeated. This is something he lived, something he burned through in the fire of his own experience, something that nearly cost him his reputation, his sanity in the eyes of others, and possibly even his life. Now let me tell you about another extraordinary chapter of Bayazid's spiritual life, one that would go on to influence Islamic mystical literature for centuries afterward, right up through the great Persian poets like Rumi and Attar. This is the story of what is known as Bayazid's mystical ascension, his Miraj, deliberately modeled in imitation of the great night journey and ascension of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who, according to Islamic belief, was taken on a miraculous journey through the seven heavens into the very presence of God. Bayazid, in his own visionary and ecstatic experience, described a journey of the soul that mirrors this sacred pattern. He described how his spirit rose up, level by level, through veil after veil, through realm after realm, encountering along the way the splendor of the divine throne, the vastness of celestial light, the overwhelming beauty of realities that exist utterly beyond the categories of ordinary human language. But here is what makes Bayazid's account of this ascension so unique, so different from a simple travel narrative through the heavens. At every single stage of the ascent, as he rose higher and higher, as the visions grew more magnificent and more overwhelming, God, in the account, kept saying to him, in one form or another, Bayazid, there is still something of yourself remaining within you. At every level, no matter how far he climbed, no matter how much glory surrounded him, some tiny remnant, some final trace of self-awareness, of individual identity, of Bayazidness, still clung to him like the last thread of a garment refusing to fall away. And so at each stage he had to let go of more and more and more of himself, shedding layer after layer of ego, of pride, of even his own spiritual accomplishments, of even his own awareness that he was undergoing this extraordinary journey at all, until finally, in the account he reaches a point where there is nothing of Bayazid left whatsoever. Nothing. Not his name, not his form, not his sense of being an individual soul on a journey. Only the divine reality remains, undivided, absolute, complete. This is the ultimate meaning of Fana as Bayazid taught it and lived it. Not a journey toward God as if God were a distant destination out there in space, but a journey into the dissolving of the very idea that there was ever a you separate from God to begin with. This teaching would go on to become one of the central threads running through the entire tapestry of later Sufi mysticism. When the great poet Jalaluddin Rumi, centuries later, wrote his masterwork the Mathnavi, he repeatedly referenced Bayazid Bastami, drawing on his sayings and his states to illustrate the deepest mysteries of divine love and self-transcendence. When Fariduddin Attar, the great Persian poet, wrote his famous biographical work Memorial of the Saints, he devoted a significant and loving portion of that work to the life and sayings of Bayazid, treating him as one of the towering pillars of the entire Sufi tradition. And within the great chain of spiritual transmission known as the Naqshbandi Golden Chain, one of the most important and widespread Sufi orders in the Islamic world, Bayazid Bastami is honored as one of the essential links, a master who passed the secret of this path down to his own successor, a man named Abul Hasan al-Karakani, who remarkably was born only after Bayazid's death, and who is said to have received the transmission of his teaching in a mystical, non-physical manner. A testimony to how powerfully Bayazid's spiritual presence was felt to continue even beyond the boundary of his earthly life. Let me tell you one more story about Bayazid, because I think it captures something essential about who this man truly was. Something that goes beyond the shocking, ecstatic utterances that made him famous. It is said that once Bayazid was traveling, and along his journey, he found himself passing through a graveyard. In this graveyard, he encountered another traveler, a Christian man, who was carrying with him a basket, and inside the basket, wrapped carefully, was the body of a dead dog. Bayazid, curious, asked the man why he was carrying a dead dog with such tenderness and care. And the man explained that the dog had been his loyal companion, and that he did not want to simply throw the body of his faithful friend into the road to be treated with indifference. So he was carrying it to bury it properly, out of respect and love for the years of loyal companionship the animal had given him. Now, in the strict letter of certain interpretations of religious law at that time, contact with a dead dog, contact with the animal at all in some rigid legalistic circles, might have been considered something to be avoided, something ritually impure, something a devout man should keep his distance from. And yet, when Bayazid heard this man's simple explanation, rooted in loyalty, in gratitude, in tenderness toward a creature who had served him faithfully, something in Bayazid's heart broke open with recognition and humility. He realized in that moment that here was a man practicing something profoundly beautiful, a devotion, a faithfulness, a purity of heart, completely independent of formal religious law, completely independent of theological correctness. And it is said that this encounter humbled Bayazid so deeply that it became one of the turning points that opened him further along his mystical path, teaching him that the true essence of spirituality cannot be reduced to outward correctness alone, that the heart's sincerity, wherever it is found, in whatever form, carries within it a spark of the same divine truth he had spent his entire life pursuing. I share this story with you because I do not want you to walk away tonight thinking of Bayazid Bastami only as a wild, ecstatic figure shouting strange and shocking words in the throes of spiritual intoxication. Yes, that side of him is real, and it is important, and it is one of the most electrifying aspects of his legacy. But there is another side of Bayazid that is equally important, a side marked by profound humility, by tenderness, by a piercing awareness of his own smallness before the vastness of the divine. In fact, some of his most beautiful recorded sayings are not proclamations of grandeur at all, but expressions of the deepest possible humility. He is reported to have said that he wanted not to want, meaning that he had reached a state in which even his spiritual desires, even his longing for closeness with God, had to be surrendered, because even that longing, if held on to too tightly, could become just another subtle form of ego, another subtle way of saying, I want this for myself. His successor Karakani would later reflect on this very saying, explaining that when Bayazid said, I want not to want, this itself paradoxically was the deepest and most real form of desire, a desire so pure it no longer needed anything, not even the fulfillment of its own longing. This is the paradox at the very center of Bayazid Bastami's entire spiritual message, and I think it is a paradox worth sitting with for the rest of our lives, whatever our beliefs may be. The deepest form of freedom is not found in getting everything you want. It is found in no longer needing to want anything at all, because you have discovered that you already exist within the very source of everything you were ever searching for. The deepest form of greatness is not found in building yourself up, decorating your name, expanding your reputation, accumulating power and possessions and praise. It is found paradoxically in the courage to let all of that fall away, to stand utterly empty before the truth, and to discover that in that emptiness, nothing of value is actually lost. Bayazid Bastami is remembered for saying that for years he thought he was worshipping God, striving toward God, working toward closeness with God, until the day came when he realized that in truth, God had been drawing him the entire time. That his very will to seek, his very effort, his very spiritual striving had itself been a gift, not something he had generated purely on his own. This is a staggering reversal of the ordinary human ego's understanding of spiritual effort. We like to believe that we are the heroes of our own spiritual journey, that through our own discipline and willpower we climb toward the divine. Bayazid, at the summit of his mystical realization, saw it completely differently. He saw that even the climbing itself had been carried by a grace far greater than his own effort. That the seeker and the sought were never, in the deepest sense, two separate things at all. Now, I know that some of you listening to me tonight may come from very different backgrounds, different religions, different philosophies, or perhaps no religious background at all. And I want to say something important here. You do not have to accept every theological detail of the Islamic mystical tradition to be moved and instructed by the life of Bayazid Bastami. Because underneath the specific religious language of Fana and Baka, of divine union and ecstatic utterance, there is a universal human truth being pointed to, a truth that appears again and again across nearly every great spiritual and philosophical tradition throughout human history. It is the truth that our small, anxious, grasping sense of separate self, the self that is constantly comparing, competing, defending, and worrying, is not actually the deepest or most real part of who we are. It is the truth that peace, real peace, is found not in strengthening the walls of that small self, but in gently, courageously letting those walls come down. Think about how much suffering in your own life, in my own life, in the lives of every person you have ever known, comes directly from this exhausting project of ego maintenance. The anxiety you feel when someone criticizes you, the jealousy you feel when someone else succeeds, the bitterness you carry when you feel you have been wronged or overlooked, the endless comparison, the endless measuring of your worth against other people's worth. All of this suffering flows from the assumption that this small, separate self is the ultimate reality that must be protected and elevated at all costs. Bayazid Bastami spent his entire life demonstrating, through extreme practice, through radical honesty, through relentless spiritual searching, that this assumption is an illusion, and that beneath it lies something infinitely more spacious, more peaceful, and more real. Let us return for a moment to the town of Bastami itself, where Bayazid lived out the majority of his life and where he ultimately died, in the year 261 of the Islamic calendar, corresponding to around 874 or 875 of the Common Era, though some sources place his death slightly earlier, around 848. Even the uncertainty surrounding the exact dates of his birth and death tells us something about how much legend and reverence surrounded this man, even in the earliest generations after his passing, as his story was told and retold by devoted followers who cared more about preserving the spirit of his teaching than pinning down precise historical bookkeeping. His tomb still stands in Bastami to this very day, and it remains even now, more than a millennium later. A place of pilgrimage, a place where seekers, scholars, and ordinary devout men and women travel to sit in quiet reflection, to seek blessing, to remember the extraordinary life of a man who dared to lose himself completely in the search for ultimate truth. It is worth noting that Bayazid himself, unlike many of the great spiritual masters of history, is not known to have written any books. He left behind no formal treatise, no systematic theological text laying out his teachings in an organized way. What we know of him comes down to us instead through roughly 500 sayings and reported states, transmitted orally by his own family members, disciples, and by those who traveled to visit him and record what they witnessed. Chief among these transmitters was his nephew and close attendant, a man named Abu Musa Isa ibn Adam, through whose family line many of these sayings were carefully preserved and eventually translated from the Persian, in which Bayazid originally spoke, into the Arabic, in which they have come down to us in the classical sources, a translation effort undertaken in part by the great sober mystic Junaid of Baghdad himself, showing us that even the more cautious, composed school of Sufism recognized the immense value and authority of Bayazid's ecstatic wisdom, despite their differing temperaments and approaches to expressing the mystical path. I find this detail deeply moving, that a man who is remembered for shouting the most radical, boundary-shattering statements ever recorded in the history of Islamic mysticism, left behind no book of his own, no carefully constructed system, no attempt to organize his experience into a tidy doctrine that future generations could simply memorize and repeat. Instead, he left behind fragments, sparks, scattered utterances caught by others in moments of overwhelming spiritual fire, and carried forward like embers passed from hand to hand across the centuries, still capable, even now, of setting alight the hearts of those who encounter them with sincerity. This too feels like a teaching in itself. The deepest truths, perhaps, cannot be fully captured in systems and structures. They can only be glimpsed, tasted, caught for a moment in the sparks that fly off a life lived at the very edge of human experience, a life pressed right up against the boundary where the self dissolves and something infinitely greater becomes visible. Consider, too, just how far these sparks eventually traveled. A man who never left the region around a small Persian town, who wrote no treatise, who commanded no army and built no empire, somehow became one of the most quoted, most studied, and most beloved figures in the entire history of Islamic spirituality. His sayings crossed from Persian into Arabic in the careful hands of Junaid of Baghdad, the very leader of the more cautious, sober school of mysticism. A man whose own temperament could not have been more different from Bayazid's wild intoxication, and yet who recognized in Bayazid's words a truth too important to be lost or dismissed, simply because it made him uncomfortable. Centuries later, in the great libraries and lodges of Persia, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Anatolia and beyond, Bayazid's name would be invoked again and again by poets, teachers and ordinary seekers, all of them wrestling with the same question he wrestled with in that small room in Bastam. Where does the self end, and where does the divine begin? The Naqshbandi order, which today counts millions of followers across the world, from Central Asia to South Asia, from the Middle East to Turkey, to communities scattered now across Europe and the Americas, traces its own spiritual lineage directly back through Bayazid Bastami, treating him not as a distant historical curiosity, but as a living link in an unbroken chain of transmission, a chain that practitioners believe still carries real spiritual power today, more than a millennium after his death. Even outside the strict boundaries of formal Sufi orders, his name continued to surface again and again, wherever people gathered to speak of the mystical dimension of religious life, invoked by philosophers studying comparative mysticism, by modern spiritual teachers searching for language to describe the experience of ego dissolution, and by ordinary readers who stumble upon his sayings for the first time and feel something in themselves recognize, however faintly, the truth he was pointing toward. I want to close tonight by asking you to consider what it might mean to carry even a small fragment of Bayazid Bastami's courage into your own life. I am not asking you to go out and declare your own divinity, and please, do not misunderstand the meaning of his most famous utterance as some kind of license for arrogance or self-glorification, because that is precisely the opposite of what his entire life was about. What I am asking is something quieter, something more available to every single one of us in our ordinary daily lives. I am asking you to consider honestly how much of your energy, your worry, your suffering is spent defending and decorating a small, separate self that, as Bayazid discovered after 30 years of searching, may not be nearly as solid, as fixed, or as important as we habitually believe it to be. I am asking you to consider what might feel like to loosen your grip, even slightly, on the need to be right, to be seen, to be praised, to be first, to be remembered. I am asking you to consider what freedom might feel like on the other side of that loosening. Bayazid Bastami searched for God his entire life and discovered, in the end, that the very self doing the searching had to disappear before the truth could fully reveal itself. He climbed through vision after vision of heavenly glory, only to find that even his awareness of climbing had to be surrendered before he could reach the final destination. He spoke words so radical that his own community nearly destroyed him for them. And yet those very words, once understood correctly, became one of the most treasured teachings in the entire history of Islamic spirituality, studied and revered by mystics, poets, and scholars for more than 1,000 years, from Junaid to Hallaj, from Attar to Rumi, from the mystics of ancient Khurasan, all the way down to seekers sitting in rooms just like this one tonight, more than 11 centuries later, still trying to understand what it truly means to lose yourself completely in something greater than yourself. So let me leave you with this final thought. Somewhere in the archives of Islamic mystical literature, there is a story of a man knocking on a door, asking for Bayazid, and Bayazid himself answering that he too has been searching for Bayazid for 30 years and cannot find him. Tonight, I invite each one of you to ask yourselves that same question. If someone knocked on the door of your heart tonight, and asked to see the real you, the true you, the essential you beneath all the titles, the achievements, the fears, the reputation, the roles you play for other people, what would you find there? Would you find a fixed, solid, unchanging self demanding to be defended at all costs? Or might you find, if you search deeply and honestly enough, exactly what Bayazid Bastami found? An open door, a vast silence, and behind it, something infinitely larger than the small name you have been carrying your entire life. This, friends, is the mystical journey of Bayazid Bastami, the man who lost himself in God, and in losing himself, found everything.